In the spring of 1961, during a farm liquidation auction just outside Pratt, Kansas, a 9-year-old girl named Della Puett spent 35 cents on a large coffee can filled with rust-covered horseshoes. These were not polished antiques. They were not decorative pieces someone had carefully collected and saved. They were old shoes pulled from dead or retired horses, then tossed into the darkest corner of a barn that probably had not been swept since Dwight Eisenhower entered the White House. The Maxwell House can was packed so tightly that several of the shoes had practically fused together beneath years of corrosion. Some still had bent nails lodged in their holes. 2 were split completely across the toe, likely broken when a horse slipped on frozen ground and never worked again. The auctioneer, a man named Burl Akoof, who conducted estate and liquidation sales across 3 counties, had nearly left the can out of the sale altogether. He lifted it by the wire handle, felt its weight, and called out, "Does anybody want this? It's heavy." Della raised her hand. Inside her coat pocket, she had 2 dimes, 1 nickel, and 10 pennies. She placed every coin she owned on the tailgate of Burl's truck. The men gathered behind the sale began to laugh. It was not cruel laughter. It was the warm, unquestioning laughter of people who were absolutely convinced they had just witnessed the most ridiculous thing anyone in Pratt County had done in quite some time. A little girl wearing a wool coat had spent her entire allowance on a coffee can full of rusty horseshoes at a dead farmer's auction. Before sunset, the story had reached the feed store on Main Street. By the end of the week, it had traveled to the cooperative beside Highway 54, the diner near the grain elevator, and the parking lot outside First Baptist Church. Everywhere it went, people told it with the amused affection small farming towns often reserve for children who make decisions adults cannot understand. They said Harlan Puett's youngest daughter had wasted all her money on scrap metal. They said she carried the can home on her lap in the truck, as though it contained something precious. They said she placed it carefully inside the barn, instead of throwing it on the junk pile. For years, people continued laughing whenever the story came up. It was the easy kind of laughter people use when they believe something is harmless and already forgotten. They stopped laughing in 1983, but that part comes later. First, you need to understand Della Puett. Because what she eventually did with those horseshoes, and with everything she collected afterward, only makes sense when you understand who she was and who taught her to look at the world differently. Della Jean Puett was born on a dryland wheat farm 4 miles east of Pratt, Kansas. The property covered 320 acres of land that her grandfather had first broken from native prairie grass in 1923. It was flat country, flat enough that you could see a storm approaching from 40 miles away. It was also honest country. The soil, the wind, and the weather told you quickly whenever you had made a bad decision. Della's father, Harlan Puett, was neither a large man nor a loud one. But to Della, he was the most capable person alive. She spent much of her childhood watching him and trying to understand how he seemed able to repair nearly anything. Harlan had grown up beside a father who fixed machinery with whatever materials were available. As an adult, Harlan carried that philosophy farther than most men of his generation considered reasonable. He refused to purchase something new when an older item could be repaired or rebuilt. He would not pay another person to perform work he believed he could learn to do himself. And under no circumstances did he believe in borrowing money. His workshop stood behind the farmhouse. It was a 40-foot-long concrete block building with a corrugated metal roof. A wood stove occupied one corner, burning hedgewood every morning from October until April. Along the north wall stood a workbench made from thick oak boards. Harlan had milled those boards himself from a tree that fell during the great windstorm of 1944. The bench stretched almost the entire length of the building. Above it hung a pegboard Harlan had cut and mounted by hand. His tools were arranged according to function, shape, and size with such care that the room felt less like a farm shop and more like a library. The forge in the southeast corner had once belonged to a blacksmith in Kingman who retired in 1938. The heavy post vise attached to the end of the bench came from an estate auction in 1941. The drill press standing in the center of the shop had been purchased in 1947 from a machine business in Wichita that was replacing its old equipment. Harlan had carried it home in the bed of his truck, wrapped in burlap to protect it from the road dust. Every tool in the building had a past. Harlan remembered every one of those histories. and he told them to Dela in the same way other fathers told bedtime stories. He did not teach Dela a specific trade. What he gave her was a method of looking at things. He explained that every piece of metal had a history and another possible purpose, regardless of how damaged or useless it appeared in its present condition. Rust did not mean death, he told her. Rust was simply evidence of time, and time could often be undone with heat, labor, patience, and the correct abrasive. He taught her that the distinction between scrap and useful material depended almost entirely on the person examining it. He showed her how to study the grain of iron. He showed her how to recognize a horseshoe made by a skilled blacksmith and distinguish it from one produced carelessly. He taught her to feel whether a piece of steel had been shaped hot or forced into shape cold, and how that history determined what could safely be done with it next. One afternoon, while reshaping a shoe for one of their own horses, Harlan told her that the horseshoe was among the most precisely designed objects used on an ordinary farm. Its weight mattered. Its width mattered. The heel angle, nail pattern, thickness, balance, and curve all depended on the animal, the soil, and the work the horse was expected to perform. A good horseshoe isn't simple, he said. It comes from someone understanding exactly what is needed and having enough skill to make it. He rested the hot shoe on the anvil and studied it. Most people look at a horseshoe and think about good luck, he continued. I see 40 years of metallurgy. Della was 11 when he told her that. She remembered it for the rest of her life. She performed well in school. Several teachers told Harlan that his daughter should consider attending college. At 17, Dela thought seriously about it. A counselor at Pratt High School handed her a brochure from Kansas State University. She kept it beside her bed for 2 weeks before quietly placing it inside a drawer. The farm remained the farm. Her 2 older brothers had already left. Gene moved to Wichita. Dale followed a woman to Oklahoma City. Without any formal discussion, the workload gradually shifted onto Dela and her father. The change happened so slowly that she did not recognize it until it was complete. By 18, she was working the wheat harvest beside Harlan. By 20, she managed the farm accounts. At 22, Harlan's heart began causing trouble. The doctor in Pratt ordered him to reduce his workload. From that point forward, Dela managed the farm while her father spent most of his time in the shop. Harlan Pwitt died in March of 1974. It happened on a Tuesday morning inside the workshop. He had been rebuilding a water pump belonging to a neighbor whose irrigation system had failed just as planting season approached. The neighbor was already behind, and Harlan had offered to help without expecting payment. Della found him at the workbench when she came to bring him coffee. The repaired pump sat beside him. It had been cleaned, rebuilt, and completely reassembled. It was ready to install. Della noticed that detail. She noticed it in the precise, unsentimental manner her father had taught her to observe everything. He had completed the job before he died. That was the kind of man Harlan Pwitt had always been. Dela inherited the 320-acre farm, fully paid for. She inherited the workshop and every tool inside it. She also inherited a savings account at Pratt County Bank containing $14,200, accumulated through 4 decades of Harlan refusing to spend money unless it was necessary. There was no mortgage. There were no machinery payments. There was no operating loan. There was no debt of any kind. At 22 years old, Della Pwitt became the sole owner of a debt-free farm in Pratt County, Kansas. She intended to keep it that way. Her brother Gene drove down from Wichita for the funeral and remained for 3 days. Before leaving, he cautiously suggested that she might consider selling part of the property. Not everything, he explained. Only enough land to provide additional operating money and give her some financial breathing room. Della thanked him and promised she would consider it. She never sold an acre. Now we return to the horseshoes. When 9-year-old Della looked inside the coffee can she purchased at the Akoof auction in 1961, she did not see what everyone around her saw. She had already learned not to. She had spent years standing beside her father's forge, watching him restore usefulness to objects other people considered worthless. To Dela, that can did not contain junk. It contained raw material. More specifically, it contained high-carbon iron that had already been shaped, hammered, tempered, and tested by blacksmiths who understood their work. It was available for 35 cents only because everyone else had stopped recognizing its value. By the time she turned 12, she had developed a routine. Whenever she heard about a liquidation auction, farm clearance, or estate sale, she searched the miscellaneous lots. Auctioneers often bundled old horseshoes together because sorting them required more effort than they were worth. Della bought every group she could afford. At first, she used her allowance. Later, she used money earned by helping neighboring families during harvest. She sorted each shoe by size, condition, weight, nail pattern, and quality of iron. Her father built a shelf for her along the eastern wall of the shop. She stored the shoes inside coffee cans and labeled every container in her own handwriting. By 16, she had cataloged more than 200 horseshoes. By the time Harlan died, she owned more than 600. Almost nobody in Pratt County knew. They remembered the amusing story of the little girl who had wasted 35 cents at the Acuff sale. They did not realize she had continued collecting horseshoes for 13 years. That was why no one understood what happened next. They believed they were looking at a young woman with a barn full of rusty iron. In reality, they were watching the first stage of a plan that had been developing since 1961. What followed proved that inherited knowledge, careful preparation, and patient accumulation could solve a problem that money alone could not. In the autumn of 1974, 6 months after her father's death, Della drove to a farm outside Medicine Lodge in Barber County. There, she purchased a Champion No. 1 post vise that had been sitting inside a partially collapsed shed for an unknown number of years. The price was $8. Della had spotted the item in a classified advertisement in the Pratt County newspaper beneath the heading Miscellaneous Farm Items. She drove 45 minutes each way on a weekday morning to inspect it before anyone else could call. The jaws were slightly misaligned. The screw mechanism had frozen solid. The mounting plate had a crack along one edge, though the damage had not reached the structural center. Della bought it. She loaded the heavy vise into her truck without assistance and drove back to the farm. 3 months earlier, she had visited a retired farrier named Eldon Schrock in Kingman County. Eldon was selling his equipment. From him, Della purchased a full set of Pritchell tools, a turning hammer, a driving hammer, nail pullers, and a clenching block. She paid $22 for everything. Eldon Schrock was 81 years old. He had shoed horses throughout Kingman County since 1918. For nearly 2 hours, he sat with Della and explained each tool what it was designed to do, how he held it, and the mistakes young farriers commonly made. Della sat on a hay bale and listened to every word. She did not interrupt him once. She had been considering this plan for years. The idea itself was simple. Carrying it out required nearly everything Harlan had ever taught her. In the middle of the 1970s, Pratt County still had working horses. There were not many, but there were enough. Ranchers kept quarter horses for cattle work. A few older farmers owned draft crosses because they preferred them or could not imagine the farm without them. Other families kept horses that performed real work every day. All of those animals required hoof care and shoes. The nearest active farrier lived in Kingman, almost 40 miles away. He was usually booked 6 to 8 weeks in advance, and his customers paid both his regular fee and his travel charges. There was an unmet need. Della had noticed it long before most people recognized that it existed. She spent the winter of 1974 and the spring of 1975 working inside her father's shop. Using a technique Harlan had taught her for repairing cracked cast iron, she restored the Champion vise. The process required gradual heating, the correct welding rod, and even slower cooling. She repaired the mounting plate and installed the vise at the end of the workbench where her father's old vise had stood. She loosened the seized screw with penetrating oil, controlled heat, and 2 full days of patience. She restored Eldon Schrock's old tools using the wire wheel on the bench grinder. She treated the wooden handles with linseed oil and replaced the ones that could not be saved. Then she fired the forge for the first time since Harlan's death. She worked through her horseshoe collection one piece at a time. This time, she sorted them according to the quality she could feel after the metal became hot. Shoes with enough carbon and structural integrity were reserved for reshaping. Pieces too badly damaged to return to a horse were saved as raw stock for future repairs and fabrication. The expenses required to begin her business were remarkably small. The Champion Post vise cost $8. Eldon Schrock's tool collection cost $22. The first winter supply of forge coal cost $14. The welding rod and flux used to repair the vise cost $3.40. A replacement wire wheel for the grinder cost $2.10. Linseed oil and replacement handle material cost $4. Nails, clips, rasps, files, and miscellaneous hardware cost $31. Her total investment was $84.50. Add the 35 cents she had spent 13 years earlier on the coffee can that started her collection, and the entire operation had cost $84.85. In 1975, a professional farrier visiting Pratt County charged approximately $18 to $22 per horse, plus mileage from Kingman. A rancher with 6 working horses could spend more than $130 every 6 to 8 weeks. Then he had to wait. Della charged $14 per horse. She charged no mileage within the area. In most cases, she could arrive within 7 days. The first horse she shoed professionally belonged to a rancher named Virgil Yancey. Virgil raised cattle on roughly a section and a half east of Pratt. He had been waiting 9 weeks for the Kingman farrier. His best cutting horse had lost 2 shoes and had begun favoring the left front hoof. Virgil was not known for patience. His wife had heard someone at the cooperative mention that Harlan Puitt's daughter was doing farrier work. On a Wednesday morning, Virgil drove to the Puitt farm. He came more from desperation than confidence. Standing near the barn fence, he watched Della work. The horse stood in cross ties inside the barn aisle. Della moved with the measured efficiency of someone who had practiced for many years. In one sense, she had. Harlan had cared for their horses throughout her childhood. Della had watched, assisted, and learned from the moment she was tall enough to hold a tool. She cleaned the hoof and examined its angle. From her sorted inventory, she selected a shoe close to the correct dimensions. She heated it in the forge and adjusted the curve until the fit was exact. Then she set the shoe, drove the nails, and clenched them with careful precision. Virgil had spent his life around horses. He immediately recognized competent work. When Della finished, he removed his hat and rubbed it against the back of his neck. He looked at the horse. Then he looked at Della. Then he studied the horse again. "You learned that from Harlan," he said. "Harlan and about 600 horseshoes," Della answered. Virgil paid her $14. When he returned home, he told 3 other ranchers exactly what he had witnessed. This was not the old story from the Akoof auction. This was a different kind of story. It was one farmer telling another about something he had personally seen. The new story was not about a little girl throwing away her allowance. It was about a woman who had spent 15 years preparing for an opportunity that no one else had noticed. By 1978, Della had built a farrier business serving 43 horses across 4 counties. She never purchased an advertisement. She never borrowed money for equipment. She did not buy a truck-mounted forge, a factory-made anvil stand, or any of the expensive accessories advertised in farrier catalogs. She had Harlan's shop. She had Harlan's forge. She had her collection of reusable iron. And she had a set of abilities that had been developing since she was strong enough to lift a hammer. Her overhead consisted mainly of coal, horseshoe nails, and rasps. Her truck was fully paid for. Her farm was fully paid for. In addition to the income produced by her wheat acreage, she deposited between $4,000 and $6,000 a year into Pratt County Bank. She accomplished it without owing money to anyone. By then, the men at the feed store had mostly stopped telling the story about the old auction. It was not because they finally understood what Della had done. They had simply forgotten. Communities often forget details that do not fit the story they are currently telling themselves. During the late 1970s, the story Pratt County told itself was about growth. Land prices were rising. Crop prices were strong. Credit was easy. The local theory of farming had become a simple cycle. Borrow money to expand. Expand production to repay the loan. Borrow again to expand farther. Farmers who once cultivated 200 acres began operating 500. Men who had owned 1 dependable tractor purchased 2 or 3 newer machines. The equipment dealer in Pratt enjoyed his best business since the Second World War. The bank on Main Street performed even better. Nearly everyone was building through credit. The future appeared to promise permanent growth. Della watched these changes from the Puitt farm with the same expression she used when studying clouds on the horizon. She was attentive and calm. She was neither pleased nor frightened. Her father had taught her to examine conditions and reach conclusions without allowing hope or fear to perform the arithmetic. By 1979, Dela had approximately $47,000 in the bank. Her land was paid for. Her shop was paid for. Her truck was paid for. Her recurring expenses were coal, nails, rasps, seed, fuel, and property taxes on 320 acres. Those expenses remained within a few $100s of the same total each year. She had intentionally designed her operation so that very little could change unless she personally chose to change it. There were no variable interest rates, no large equipment payments, no borrowed money that could suddenly be demanded. Then the early 1980s arrived. Interest rates climbed toward 18%. Crop prices fell far below the assumptions used in farm expansion plans. Corn and wheat revenues could no longer support debts calculated during the prosperous years. Land values that had risen for more than a decade began falling, and they continued falling. Between 1981 and 1986, 11 farms in Pratt County went to auction. These were not voluntary liquidation sales. They were foreclosure auctions. The bank held the loans. The sheriff posted the notice. Neighbors stood in family yards and watched entire lifetimes sold by the acre. Virgil Yancey lost the eastern half of his property in 1983. He had borrowed against the land in 1978 to purchase equipment. When the loan came due, the land was worth less than the amount he owed. The equipment was worth even less. Virgil was not irresponsible. He was not a poor farmer. He had followed the recommendations of the bank. He had followed the expansion model encouraged by agricultural advisors. He had done what his neighbors were doing and calling progress. The problem was not that he had acted recklessly. The problem was that the entire system had relied on assumptions that proved false. Virgil had built his operation inside that system, just as almost everyone else had. Dela's costs did not rise. They could not. She had no adjustable loan and no large payment schedule. There was almost nothing to reduce because she had never expanded through debt in the first place. She watched the foreclosure sales with quiet sorrow. Then she returned to work. In the autumn of 1983, the 160 acres directly east of the Putte farm were scheduled for foreclosure auction. The property was known locally as the Schrock ground. It was good wheat land, level, clean, and productive. A functioning irrigation well stood near the northeast corner. Dela's father had helped Eldon Schrock's father drill that well in 1951. The bank established an opening bid of $280 per acre. That price was substantially below the land's value in 1979, yet it remained higher than most of the men at the sale were prepared to pay. Many were already carrying more debt than they could comfortably manage. Purchasing additional property required confidence, and the previous several years had stripped that confidence away. Only two other serious bidders appeared. One was a land speculator from Wichita who had been attending foreclosure auctions throughout the region. The other was a farmer from the neighboring county, hoping to acquire inexpensive acreage. The speculator opened at $280 an acre. The visiting farmer raised the bid to $295. The speculator offered $310. Dela said, $340. The speculator turned toward her. The other farmer turned toward her. Even the auctioneer paused. Burl Akoof had retired by then, and another man was conducting the sale. He looked directly at Dela. "Do I hear 350? No one answered. The land belonged to her. 160 acres at $340 per acre. The final amount was $54,400. Dela wrote a check from her account at Pratt County Bank. 18 months earlier, the balance had been approximately $47,000. By the morning of the auction, it had grown to more than $61,000 because she continued depositing money and had encountered no debt that required her to withdraw it. The crowd became silent. It was not the ordinary silence of people waiting for the next bid. It was the unmistakable quiet that occurs when an entire community must reconsider everything it believed about a person. People standing in small groups looked at one another. Then they looked at Dela. Then they looked across the land she had just purchased with cash. The Wichita speculator folded his auction catalog, placed it inside his coat, and walked toward his car. The farmer from the neighboring county remained still for a moment. Then he approached Dela while she signed the paperwork. "I knew your father," he said. "Most people around here did," Dela replied. He motioned toward the surrounding field. He would have liked seeing this. Dela signed the final page and lifted her eyes. He already knew I would do it, she said. I only needed to wait until the price came back down. The story leaving that auction was nothing like the one that had begun at Burl Akuf's sale 22 years earlier. This story traveled more slowly. It required the people telling it to acknowledge something uncomfortable about their own judgment. It moved from the auction to the feed store. From the feed store, it reached the cooperative. Then it traveled to the diner near the grain elevator. At every stop, the details were repeated more carefully and in quieter voices. No one laughed. They were trying to understand. For the following 2 decades, Dela Puit farmed 480 acres of debt-free land in Pratt County. She continued farrier work until the middle of the 1990s. Eventually, her niece reminded her that earning a living while bent beneath horses had a natural physical limit. Dela reduced her schedule. She continued working only on selected horses, and for neighbors she had served since Virgil Yancey's cutting horse arrived in 1975. The workshop behind the farmhouse remained almost exactly as Harlan had left it. His tools still hung on the pegboard above the long oak bench. The forge remained in the southeast corner. The repaired Champion vise stayed attached to the end of the bench, where Dela had mounted it in 1974. The coffee cans filled with carefully sorted horseshoes remained on the shelf along the eastern wall. Dela never removed them. Her niece Cassie, Jean's youngest daughter, began spending summers at the farm when she was 12. Cassie seemed to have inherited more of Harlan's temperament than Jean ever had. By 14, she entered the workshop before breakfast nearly every morning. Dela started teaching her on the drill press in the same manner Harlan had once taught Dela. She handed Cassie a piece of scrap iron, gave her basic instructions, and expected the girl to understand the rest through observation and effort. Cassie was 15 when she lit the forge by herself for the first time. Dela stood in the doorway and watched her heat and shape a piece of metal. She offered no advice because none was required. The girl understood. She had the same patience, the same eye, the same instinct for recognizing what the metal naturally wanted to do and what it needed to be persuaded to do. Harlan's way of seeing had passed intact across 2 generations inside a concrete block workshop on a Kansas wheat farm. In 1997, the Pratt County Farm Bureau invited Dela to speak at its annual meeting. She was 45 years old. She had managed debt-free farmland for 23 years. Public speaking did not interest her, and she rarely accepted invitations. This time, she attended because someone had asked, and because she believed she finally had something useful to say. Dela stood behind the podium for approximately 3 minutes. She carried no written notes. I want to ask you a question, she began. When you look at a piece of scrap iron, what do you see? She paused. Most people see the end of something. They see what the object used to be and assume it can never be useful again. My father taught me to look for what it could still become if someone was willing to perform the work. He taught me that the difference between scrap and material depends almost entirely on who is looking at it. And I learned that the same principle applies to land, time, and money. I have farmed in this county for 23 years without a mortgage, without an equipment note, and without an operating line of credit. During those years, I watched many good farmers lose land they had spent their lives building. They did not lose it because they were lazy or foolish. They lost it because the payment was still due when the crop price was not high enough to make it. I am not smarter than those farmers. I am not a better farmer than most of them. I simply had a father who taught me that the only thing a bank cannot take away is something you already own completely. And I believed him. That is all I wanted to say. Act. Dela stepped away from the microphone. Virgil Yancey was seated in the 3rd row. After losing part of his property, he had leased some of it back from the investment company that purchased it at foreclosure. He was still farming. That fact said something about the persistence Dela had always respected in him. When she sat down, Virgil caught her eye. He gave her a slow and deliberate nod, the nod of a man who had spent many years considering an idea and had finally reached his conclusion. Dela nodded in return. That was the entire conversation. It was enough. Cassie Puit assumed responsibility for the farm's daily operation in 2004. She was 26. The shop became hers. The forge became hers. The tools hanging above the oak bench became hers. The coffee cans of sorted horseshoes along the eastern wall also became hers. By then, Cassie had added considerably to the collection. She had inherited more than the metal. She had inherited the habit of noticing value in objects other people walked past. The farm remained fully paid for. The machinery was paid for. There was no debt. The account at Pratt County Bank contained an amount Della refused to discuss publicly. Her accountant once described the balance to a colleague as highly unusual for an agricultural operation of that size. So what do you see when you look inside a coffee can filled with rusty horseshoes? Most people see 35 cents of scrap iron. Harlan Put saw decades of metallurgy. Della Put saw the beginning of an opportunity. The people of Pratt County saw a little girl wasting her allowance at a dead farmer's sale. For years, they laughed whenever they told the story. They stopped laughing on a Tuesday morning in 1983. That was the morning Della wrote a check for $54,400 and purchased the farm next door. While much of the county was struggling to make payments on land and machinery it did not fully own. 35 cents. One coffee can. A forge that had burned in the same corner of the same workshop since 1938. Hundreds of old horseshoes no one else wanted. All placed in the hands of a woman almost no one understood. Then the bank held the auction. The crowd fell silent, and the only sound remaining was Della's pen moving across the check.